Let's talk about Chaco a little bit. A rather memorable figure for one that we know very little about, actually. It is believed that Chaco in Canto 6 of the Inferno, it was a real person, that Dante knew him. It seems like he implies that he was much older than Dante, right? He was unmade after Dante had been made. This doesn't seem to imply that they were particularly close in age or relation. But he's memorable probably because of, his name, Chaco, the hog. This rather larger than life, quite literally, figure rolling around perpetually naked in his own filth, trying constantly to warm himself. But as he turns to his left, snow, dirty snow, not even just snow, but dirty snow, dirty water, and hail fall on his side. And so he turns to warm that side that's getting rained and hailed on, and of course he has to continue this ad infinitum, constantly rolling. At least for a moment when Dante stops him, he gets a break. He talks a little bit about his sin, which is gluttony. But notice that even though we have this hog-like figure, indeed here literally the hog, the gluttony that he describes is not necessarily a gluttony of food. Okay, keep that in mind. It's a gluttony of unwilling to stop, a lack of moderation altogether. This is typified by the fact that, of course, who is guarding Chaco and the other gluttonous? None other than Cerberus, the three-headed dog, which we also saw in Aeneas, book 6, right? There, Cerberus is guarding the way for hell, and Aeneas turns to the Sibyl, and she takes out this honeyed loaf and throws it to Cerberus, this wonderful, beautiful treat, a divinely, not a divinely, but like a glorious thing that's worth stopping and digesting. For Dante, though, he twists this, right? Virgil instead, rather than taking the honey cake, takes clay that's seemingly dung-filled, is kind of the impression that we're supposed to get, and shoves it down the gullet of this Cerberus figure, who's kind of half man, half dog here. And in doing so, the dog is temporarily, completely stopped because he's gorging himself on this filth, this putrid filth that he's surrounded by. Great stuff. The thing that I want you to grab from this context, though, this text, this is where Dante decides to really dive in to some of the muck of his departure from Florence, his exile from Florence. This is where he gives us the background of the white and the black Guelphs. So I'll give you a little bit of context once again. I know we've discussed this in class several times. This is a gross oversimplification of the history. But the Guelphs and the Ghibellines are two warring factions in what we now know of today as Italy. During Dante's time, that had been dying down a bit, at least in the area of Florence. It had still been sparking up north of the Alps quite a bit, and I believe south of Rome as well. And the dispute between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines is ultimately, like all things, a dispute of power. Both factions recognize the legitimacy of the papal see, that is the Pope, and the legitimacy of the Holy Roman Emperor. And yet, there was kind of a question about who was in charge of who. Think back to Charlemagne and the crowning of the Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day. Okay, there's this question of, is it the Bishop of Rome, this preeminent seat in the church that has authority over the emperor and gives the emperor his power? Or is it the emperor who allows for peace to exist and therefore situates the papal see? Think of the emperor going all the way back to Constantine, where Constantine is the one who is calling the Council of Nicaea in one sense, or calling the shots. And the Pope doesn't even show up, although he does send two of his priests to become the first ones to sign the Council of Nicaea's documents. So this is always an interesting kind of battle between these two figures of power. The Guelphs largely saw the Pope as being the head of Christendom at this time, and the Ghibellines understood the Emperor was the head. Again, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's a good rule of thumb to go by. In Florence, during Dante's day, there were really no Ghibellines. They were all Guelphs, including Dante himself. But there were two factions of Guelphs, the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs. The White Guelphs, of which Dante was part, they saw themselves as, or they saw the Pope as having legitimate authority, legitimate power over the emperor, but they did not have a particularly vested allegiance in some of the current popes, especially Boniface VIII, who was reigning during the time of Dante's exile from Florence. Remember, Celestine V turned to his advisor, Benedetto. Benedetto said, "Oh, Your Eminence, Celestine, if you are so associated with worldly goods, you will be no good for heaven. So you should renounce your papal see." Celestine does this out of cowardice. And of course, Benedetto takes up the papal see, becomes Boniface VIII, and is in some ways a bit of a tyrant. Although perhaps we'll begin to look at some of his papal encyclicals, you'll see he's a complicated figure, certainly. But Dante sees him as pretty much all bad. The White Guelphs have this view of Boniface VIII and some of the other papal figures as well. They see them as, at very least, conflicted individuals, if not wholly evil men in some instances, with legitimate power over the emperor. The Black Guelphs, on the other hand, had a stronger allegiance to the papal see and the Pope himself. They recognized not only was the papal see of preeminence in Christendom over the emperor, but they also broadly approved of what Boniface VIII was doing and some of the other popes along with him. And so this is a helpful way of getting a glimpse into this conflict that's happening. So when a division between the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs arises in Florence, as Dante is coming up to power, as he's becoming one of the magistrates of Florence, the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs more or less attack each other. The White Guelphs win for a very short period of time. But within 2 years, Boniface VIII sends the Black Guelphs, and we'll get into some of the story a little later, but he sends them to thwart the White Guelphs in Florence. And since Dante aligned himself with the White Guelphs, that is why he is exiled. And so that relationship between Guelphs and Ghibellines becomes a direct cause for Dante's exile. Again, is this an interesting historical background? Of course it is. But the most interesting thing about this canto is the fact that Dante brings all of this up, which he kind of expects the reader to broadly understand, right? It's not like this is laid out in this way. You have to kind of do some digging to understand what's going on here. But he brings this up in the midst of Chaco's prophecy. Why is Chaco, the hog, the one to bring this up? That's what I want you to contemplate with this canto. And that's the thing that you really should be thinking. Why is this figure of gluttony in excess the figure that talks about some of the most prominent debates that are currently happening in the area that, again, we know of today as Italy?